Carl Gombrich. I was a professor, more accurately a professorial teaching fellow of interdisciplinary education at UCL. That's University College London, the great university in London. It's not UCLA for your North American listeners. UCL would claim that they're even greater than UCLA, I guess, but it's a very great old established institution. And I was I designed and set up and then led the implementation of a big undergraduate degree course there called the Bachelor in Arts and Sciences, which was and still is a very radical interdisciplinary program. And now there's a whole kind of talk around interdisciplinarity, which I'm fascinated by. But I think perhaps just worth pointing out that, like everything in education, it's deeply contextual. So for your North American listeners, the whole idea of liberal arts and interdisciplinarity is not perhaps that radical, but that is actually very unusual on the global scale, the global stage. And certainly in the UK, and let alone throughout Europe and the rest of the world, the idea of crossing different disciplines, making connections between them, and so on, and having this more liberal palette to your education is very radical. So in the UK, we were kind of the front runners of a new wave of interdisciplinary degrees now that are starting out. And I was very fortunate to be given the opportunity to design that with an amazing team at UCL. My background before that is very checkered. You could say it's a little bit late 20th century middle class slacker, though it was amazing and wonderful to me that when I got into my early 40s, suddenly people were saying, no, this is very contemporary, you're a lifelong learner and you're very agile, and all these terms which we use now as kind of positive attributes for graduates. But basically I'd studied maths and physics at degree level and done a lot of music, mostly classical music. I was an opera singer, but also for about 4 years I was an opera singer, but I also was a drummer. I played funk in bands. And sort of from that very eclectic background, I also learned some languages through my music. I was always very interested in literature, particularly as a young person. So I had a very broad palette, which then enabled me, when this thing kind of came together and I was in my early 40s, to I guess, build a coalition and have some vocabulary around what I wanted to do and what my bosses at UCL wanted me to do in spearheading this initiative, to bring together the team to make this wonderful interdisciplinary program. So we established that at UCL. By the time I left, we graduated about 500 students, which I know is actually small beer compared to what you're trying to do in one go on your program. So, that's very exciting to your ambition. But we were sort of in the top third of size of undergraduate degrees at UCL. And I'd learnt, and this might be interesting for the theme of today, that I was an intrapreneur. I didn't know that term until I got to UCL and started meeting people actually more in the business space and in the public sector too, because at UCL I had this fantastic brief to kind of go out and understand the world and understand what an undergraduate degree should look like in the context of the modern world. And I learned that I was an entrepreneur, that I liked being in a situation which was exciting, very high powered, wonderful people, purpose driven, but I like also shaking things up a bit and improving them, if you like, and making sure that things are going in the right direction. And so having done that at UCL and established that program, and really it made my career, I have to say. I was a bit of jumping around until pretty late in life, which I hope gives some of your listeners some hope. This entrepreneur thing became something that I could sort of embody and be proud to talk about. But that degree was kind of established. I've been on that program about 8.5 years, and actually at UCL altogether, nearly 16 years by that point. And I was approached by my current colleagues, partners at the London Interdisciplinary School, to found an entirely new university. And so actually I've moved from being entrepreneur to now a real entrepreneur, which may be an interesting distinction too. And along the way, I've learned lots about myself and my particular appetite for risk, which is another thing perhaps it would be interesting to explore. I always thought myself as very risk averse, but I realized from talking to some entrepreneur friends that I have very high capacity for risk in some areas, such as intellectual risk or public facing risk. I'm not really embarrassed about making mistakes in public. Where I was very weak was on financial risk. And I thought all entrepreneurs took a lot of financial risk. Turns out not to be the case at all. There's an interesting book by, you'll know the name of this guy, Adam, I forget his second name now. North American guy about how a lot of entrepreneurs actually are quite financially risk averse, and they hedge all sorts of things, or they live at home or so on while they're setting up their project. So I learned that about myself, and that was very liberating. That I am a sort of entrepreneur, though I don't have the full risk profile you might expect. I have some high tolerance for risks in some areas. So establishing this brand new university on entirely interdisciplinary lines, so no academic subject departments, all about real world problems, and all thinking about what you would do if you were going to start a new university in this incredibly exciting and challenging age, is what we're doing. And there's literally nothing more fascinating than that, because we all know how important education is and how challenging this age is. So we're 1 year in. I've been there about a year, and perhaps I can tell you more about the details if you're interested as we go. The London Interdisciplinary School is a brand new university in the UK that happens extremely rarely, but we're seeking what are called degree awarding powers, so we can have our own degree and also be registered as a higher education institution from scratch. That's extremely hard to do in the UK context, but there was some legislation 2 years ago which allows it, and that's what we're trying to do. So I was about the fourth or fifth person to join the project. So this isn't my baby directly. It's the baby of Ed Fido and Chris Person, who are the CEO and chairman respectively. I'm the academic lead on this project. But Ed Fido had started a progressive school in London called School 21. And he'd looked very closely at what I was doing at UCL around interdisciplinarity. And he, like many people, feel the pressure to achieve something interdisciplinary in learning in the modern world, because it seems to fit best the modern world. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question quite the right way, Beth, but those guys had done a lot of market research, particularly with schools, before I joined. So this is up to about the point of March 2019. And when I joined the school, obviously I could bring a lot of kind of intellectual and conceptual firepower to this project. And I think you can't overestimate, particularly in an intellectual space, the importance of having clear conceptual frameworks and a vocabulary that goes with it, which allows you to talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's a complex project. It needs a rich and detailed and evidence-based vocabulary in order to invite stakeholders onto the project and help have them support you. So why an entrepreneur makes a leap, I think, is a very deep question, and it's quite hard to answer. It can be a psychological attribute, a kind of restlessness to make a positive change. In my case, I think I'm very, very student focused. I felt acutely, probably because of my own background, there wasn't really a university course or institution for me where the combination of kind of deep intellectual interests and kind of intellectual free play, combining things in interesting ways, and yet kind of outward looking mission existed that just didn't really exist as a program. That was the kind of UCL motive, if you like, and this at London Interdisciplinary School is, as I've said, really taking that to the next level. I just think there's an opportunity to help or support or inspire a massive swathe of young people who look at the modern world, look at the way they're learning online through the internet, watching YouTube videos all the time, toggling between academic papers, Wikipedia, and so on, and their purpose-driven lives, and thinking, where do I go as a higher education institution to kind of connect what I'm doing with what people think of as intellectual or academic work? And so why that drives me is difficult to answer in a sense, in that I just have a fundamental value position that is a good thing to do. The intellectual tradition itself has tremendous value. Doing work of purpose in the real world, which helps real people, has tremendous value. And somehow connecting those two is kind of, has even more value, if you like, to connect the two together. So those are my drivers, that I want to create a space, a higher education space, which does that. It takes the best and the brightest, the most interesting, dedicated, alternative young people and provides them with an intellectual home in which they can develop, and then from there launch to tackle the problems that they really want to tackle. It's a fantastic question. It's a deep question, one that's worthy of a whole day-long conference. I was just thinking about it. I needed to go back to my history books on this because I was reading up more on this about 7 or 8 years ago. And you're absolutely right. It's kind of weird, this, in historical terms, this stance that universities are the kind of critic of society. You know, they certainly didn't start out that way. They started to educate lawyers, then sometime medical doctors, and of course the clergy and the religious people. And there was never this take that somehow universities were the kind of theoretical drivers of the, if you like, the self-appointed better part of society. And I do think it's a bit elitist. I'm concerned about it. And in North America, of course, you'll know more than anyone at the moment. There are these real culture wars going on, which I think are just damaging for everyone. They're damaging for cohesiveness in society. And so perhaps to answer your question of why it's happening now, it's just that we've come to a sort of impasse, right? We've come to a place now where most people, I think, can see the fractures that are happening. And it's only the extremes on both sides. There's extreme theoreticians who think their job is to critique society with some kind of publicly funded mandate, and the extreme libertarian business people who think that that's all nonsense and you don't need any of that. Those people kind of are fighting and driving some of the discussion, but I think they're in the minority. The vast majority of people see the point of education broadly construed, but are concerned that it's become too detached from the concerns of most people in their lives and most large public problems which affect everybody. So I think there is a huge space for what I want to do, which is to unite these two things again. Now I would say, and I think this is really important, at this point in history, we are living in in the West anyway, more developed nations, a knowledge economy and a digital economy. And those are inherently more intellectual and somewhat more, you could argue theoretical things. Right, so that's what excites me. So when I speak to my young entrepreneur friends, and I try to speak to them as much as possible, so I keep up with what they're thinking, what's going on, they say yes, that we crave this. We are learners. We're proper kind of university types in a sense, but we don't fit in because we don't write essays and stuff. We want to be more engaged in the real world. But they kind of recognize there's still a kind of opening of their horizons and a ceiling they can go beyond if they plug in to the best parts of what I would call intellectual tradition and academia, without ever losing their ambition to do something good in the world, to be change makers, as you put it, to change the world. And I think those are fantastic people. We should be supporting that. I am slightly at odds with the people, as I've mentioned, who think that their job is to be completely detached and just have some sort of monastic critical reflection over 3 years, and those who kind of poo-poo the notion of learning as having any value. I think we've got this large space to occupy in the middle, but we have to make the courses then relevant, and we have to connect them to these types of people and connect those two large bodies of thought and tradition, the intellectual. Arnie, thank you. I mean, I must admit this is a tough question for me, and I think I shared that with Nelson earlier, because I don't feel I'm an entrepreneur in the sense of being a social entrepreneur like some of your the younger people you're talking about might be, let alone a kind of a more capitalist entrepreneur or business-driven entrepreneur. So I'm partly going to be reporting briefly what I hear from my friends who are young entrepreneurs who tend to be maybe in their early 30s or late 20s. And I think number one I hear from them is learning. Always, always keep learning. And it may be that you deep dive into some areas. I've got a friend now in his early 30s who's doing a fascinating project trying to build a supranational e-state for stateless people and looking at what sort of currency could be used to back that e-state. And he's actually looking at trees. It sounds crazy, but it's so fantastically imaginative. It's this kind of real founders project, which, 95% of it won't work, but the learning that goes through that process will give my friend Dave Erasmus all sorts of interesting things around, just to say he's using trees because they capture carbon. So that's basically the currency. It's like the gold is the carbon capture. That backs a type of Bitcoin, which then props up your state. Amazingly speculative and fascinating, interesting. But what Dave does is he just learns. So he learns about carbon capture. Then he learns about political science. He was reading John Rawls to make an intellectual connection again. Then he learns about Bitcoin, which he was doing in his previous job, which is about charitable giving. So I think if you really want to make it these days as a social entrepreneur, the number one thing is to keep learning. Number two is, of course, and this isn't very original, never see failure as a dead end. A mistake is only a mistake if you refuse to learn from it, right? If you realize why you learn from it, all it is another step onto the next level of something. So keep going. Number 3 is be a great team builder, which I think actually ties in a little bit to some things I said before. Listen, get people around you who really challenge you, who are cleverer than you, who are perhaps younger and smarter than you, and learn to manage them sympathetically and empathetically. Obviously, they have to be people who don't mind you managing them or leading them in some way, but never, ever don't take someone because they intellectually threaten you, because they might be the most valuable asset you can have. I think that's probably all I'm going to come up with, Annie, on the spot, because I'm not young anymore and I've never really done that sort of entrepreneurship. So as far as I know, in the UK, we don't use the word public entrepreneur. We use the word social entrepreneur. That's a very well-established term in this country. And the idea is basically that the whole purpose of the organization is for positive social change, positive social impact at some point. So the fundamental value is not profit, but positive social impact. I think that's the real difference. Now, of course, to run any business in the current monetary structures we have, you have to keep the lights on and pay staff. So that leads to some very interesting business models, which you'll know a lot more about than me. But there's a very interesting organization here called Year Here, which gave completely free master's programs. You didn't have to pay to do them. And their part of the brief was that they had to pay for themselves by proving to existing public organizations that they would save them money. So if, say, you had a narcotics program run by the local council, Year Here would take young people, typically young postgrads, and say, can you set up some kind of system, some kind of entrepreneurial idea, space, process, where you can prove to this public body that they will save X amount of pounds per year, and therefore that will kind of be your salary, and have better outcomes as well. So, I mean, I nothing but admiration for these people. It's fantastically interesting and demanding financially, and also you've got the pressure that you have to do better than the existing, the incumbents, if you like, doing the job, right? So it's an amazing challenge, but very exciting if you can kind of make that work. So for us in the UK, I think social entrepreneurship covers the sort of social impact, and that is separate to someone who basically is looking to become profitable and perhaps sell and make a lot of money out of a buy-up or something like that. Now, of course, in that space too, there are a lot of purpose-driven makers and profit-driven organizations. It is a bit more blurry, of course, but I think there's a fundamental value difference, if you like. Yeah, too many. I mean, I tend to talk about my previous students who have just shown the way. They're just shining lights. And one thing I'm very passionate about is to contradict this notion that you don't get expertise out of interdisciplinary programs. So I have several stories. I could maybe start and then you can stop me if I've had enough. What I think is evident in the modern world is that the most exciting expertise comes of hybridization from existing disciplines, sometimes multiple disciplines. Hybrid is a really important word for us, I think, growing in the employment sector as well. And what you see, even in young postgraduates, is when you've hybridized, for example, real example, an interest in psychology and neuroscience and architecture, you have an amazing insight and way to progress in thinking about how the built environment affects our well-being. So UCL actually set up a whole PhD program in this called the Ecological Brain, and one of my students is a very valued member of that program because of her wonderful hybrid skill set. I have another student that's finishing a PhD at Oxford University now in environmental engineering, and she combines environmental engineering itself, environmental economics, environmental sociology, and somewhat environmental law from her past. She's an absolute go-to person to understand how to implement certain environmental projects, in her case, in small island states, actually, that are affected by climate change. I mean, she's almost kind of more niche in a funny way than a typical disciplinary scholar, but what an exciting niche expertise, and the bonus that she has this tremendously broad skill set, which she can kind of pick up and take other places. So you get the expertise from the hybridization, but you get the added bonus that you're not scared of quantitative methods. You're not scared of qualitative methods. You know how to do a case study for law. You know some of the background to, actor network theory and sociology. And so you can toggle quite easily in your career, or more easily perhaps than a single disciplinary scholar. So I think it's really important for students, particularly coming out of school or single honors programs, where the disciplinary mindset is set in them from academia, that this is the way I become an expert. That's simply not true. All the most exciting expertise at the moment is some really interesting and impactful hybridization of existing disciplines. I think the notion of specialization in the academic sense is a myth. I come back to this word hybrid. There was a very big data study recently by Burning Glass of job posts in the US, actually many billions of data points I think they took. And the word hybrid is rising in all the job advertisements as something that employers are looking for. So it goes back to my old discussion of what expertise is really, and the modern notion that interdisciplinary expertise is more interesting and more resilient than traditional academic disciplines, expertise as defined by college disciplines. Beyond that, I mean, there are some simple things you can say. You will definitely be advantaged if you can cope with basic coding. And it's really not hard to get the first, a 12-week course under your belt in Python or Dreamweaver or whatever it might be. And you'll definitely be advantaged if you can do some verbal and written and presentational communications, the soft skills stuff. So there's a very basic hybrid, which challenges some notions of expertise, that you just will be more employable if you've got some combination of these things. And then you can start to nuance that much further. Do you need laboratory skills? Do you need ethnography skills? Do you need art practice skills? Do you need design skills? And we can talk about that, but keep the hybridity in mind. That's what's important. And of course, I mean, it's just a myth that you're going to. So I would say to young people coming out of college, don't try even to build that career in the way that perhaps your parents did, and get that mortgage, get that yacht, whatever it might be you're aiming for, because there'll be masses of time to do that. You're going to be working, provided the world stands up, till you're 70 or 80. And B, it's something of a myth anyway, because of the disruption and constant change. You might have to retool straight away. So while you're young, if you can get the support networks, which something didn't really exist in my day, more of an ability to use networks to use an unfashionable phrase, to subsist a bit more, right? So you're not looking to build piles of cash or real estate and so on. But if you can use that period when you don't have family obligations to be much more experimental, to tool up in this much more hybrid and resilient way, I think that will just stand you in so much better stead for the longer run. A few people disagree with me. I have some students who just had to take that Goldman Sachs job because they really, really, really wanted to get the mortgage. And there's some point to that too. They're seeing a side of the world which is important still. I mean, it's powerful. It still makes a lot of the world go around, this sort of thing. It will suit some people, that kind of thinking. For me, and I'm guessing many of the people who might be considering your program or listening to this, it's not terribly exciting. Unlikely that the greatest innovations are going to come from those very, very established, deeply entrenched institutional environments. So if you can subsist and yet flourish with friends, low rent accommodation, using clever techniques to make or grow and make your own food, cooperatives and so on, do it. It's the time to do it when you're young, and there's so much time later to do all the other stuff.